So it is purported that South Africa is experiencing reverse racism, wherein Black South Africans are oppressing white South Africans or Afrikaners. According to reports, the South African economy is crumbling. White farmers are being targeted, and there have been more than 100 laws that are known as, quote, race-based laws that empower Blacks and oppress whites. My name is Monica Maybank, and this is the Holy Politician Podcast. On this podcast, we discuss politics, policy, and culture through the lens of truth and holiness. And typically, we describe issues that happen in the United States of America. But I think what's taking place in South Africa has implications on America, or even the reverse. What has been taking place in America is now having a real lived impact in South Africa. So if you haven't subscribed to my podcast, I would encourage you to do that now. Click the subscribe button and share this video with at least three of your friends. So, ladies and gentlemen, what's happening? What is the question? What on earth is happening in South Africa? As many of us know, apartheid was a system that inflicted racial oppression against Black people, which started around, I guess, the beginning of the 20th century. It officially became actual law in the early, kind of in the mid 1950s-ish. And then it basically they got away with apartheid in the 1990s. I believe it was 1994. Nelson Mandela was elected as the first Black president of South Africa. Well, it looks as if apartheid is making a comeback, but with the opposite effect, which is discrimination against whites. And so the question is this kind of DEI or racial equity or affirmative action gone wild? So is equity really that slippery of a slope that South Africa has literally slid itself into an abyss? And so I'm not sure. That's for you to decide and deduce on your own. But when I came across recent news clips and video articles and interviews like that I'm going to show you in a minute, and even speaking directly with Afrikaners from South Africa, I said, now hold up, wait a minute. This is really taking racial equity off of a cliff. And so in South Africa, whites are the minority, and they've been the minority. Right now, they're about 8% of the population. And according to reports, as I've just said, they're being oppressed and targeted because of their racial identity. Does this sound familiar, ladies and gentlemen? And there's so many ways that you can unpack this. But obviously, I'm not going to do that. I don't live in South Africa. I'm American. But you can do your own research on this issue. All you have to do is dig. And I haven't done extensive research like I plan to, but I just want to share a little bit about what I'm learning. Obviously, there's more people that I could talk to, more research that I can do. But I want to start with this clip by a gentleman named Ernst Roots, who's an Afrikaner, a white South African with Dutch roots. And he basically claims that South African society is collapsing. Watch this clip.
Well, the reality is that virtually every sphere of society is collapsing, with the exception of taxation, of course, and tax collection. That's still very, very efficient. So it's a very small number of people, a very small portion of society that pays tax, that is heavily taxed. And then about almost half of the population in South Africa get money from the government in the form of social grants. If you add government employees, conservative estimates say that 50% of people in South Africa get money from the government. Some estimates say it's up to 60% of adults, voting age adults, get money from the government each year. So then this money, of course, is then used. It's given out as social grants, but what's left is used to set up these programs that are actively discriminating against taxpayers. There are so many examples. One of the most recent ones is this Blacks Only Fund that the government has set up, whereby they give money to Black entrepreneurs exclusively. So this is happening. And then on top of that, so after you spend your tax money to fund these government programs that are discriminating against you, you have to spend what is left to do the things that the government was supposed to be doing. So the classical definition of a government is that it should protect life, liberty, and property. The classical liberal view, we're a bit Ciceronian, so we think a government has to do more than that. But if we use those three things, the government's not protecting our lives. There's about if this interview that we're about to have is 2 hours, there will be about 7 murders in South Africa in this time. Government does not protect liberty. It's actively targeting schools of minority communities, actively denying the identity and the rights of minority communities. And it's certainly not protecting property. It's actively involved with the program to empower the government to expropriate private property without compensation.
So one of the issues that he describes towards the end of that clip is something called expropriation without compensation. And so in January of this year, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa signed into law a bill that allows land seizures essentially by the state without compensation. And so Black South Africans, which are, the majority of South Africa, even though they're the majority of the country, they only own a small fraction of farmland in South Africa. And this is more than 30 years after the end of apartheid, right? And so the majority remains with the white minority, which, as I described earlier, is only 8% of the population. And so this has led to frustration and anger over the slow pace of reform. And so this law is meant to appease Black South Africans from that slow pace of change. It allows for your land to be taken without compensation. And it's only in certain circumstances where they consider it, quote, just and equitable in the public interest to do so. And so that is kind of a slippery slope in and of itself, because who deems what is just and who deems what is equitable? Even in the United States, we can't decide on what just and equitable means, let alone equality. And there's language that can be reinterpreted and misconstrued and really not meet the full weight of a law is intended for it to meet. And so if you have these expropriation laws and you have this constant tenor within the country that's bubbling up, to which Black people, who are the minority, are sick of not having equity and representation across really the economy, then who's to say that the government is not going to seize somebody's land because they are a white landowner, because they consider it just and equitable? And so this is what I mean by a slippery slope. It's purported that there are more than 100 laws like this now in South Africa that discriminate against white South Africans. And so, if this is truly the case, do we consider this progress? Right? This does not look like progression to me. It looks like regression. When we allow one group that has historically been oppressed to then become the oppressor, does that really make things equal? Does that make them equitable? Is that payback? Right? Is this what God intended? Now, I understand and I get it. Like, I didn't live during the civil rights era. And part of me is very thankful that I didn't live during that time or the time that preceded, obviously, the civil rights era. And so I understand that oppressed groups become tired and weary of being oppressed and waiting years and sometimes generations to see change. And sometimes they may never see it, right? They may not see it in their lifetime, and maybe their children won't see it in their lifetime. But does that then mean that we turn the tables and say, well, now that we're the majority, but in the case of South Africa, they were always a majority. But say, for example, in the United States, when by the year 2041, whites will no longer be the majority, does that mean then that we start to oppress whites because we start to give more open doors and access and opportunity to non-whites because whites are no longer the majority? At the end of the day, like everything that we talk about on this podcast, what does God's word say? And what is truth? And what does holiness reflect? Well, one of the most fundamental scriptures in the Bible is in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 40. And this is when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And so if we cannot love our neighbor as we do ourselves, then essentially we're not loving God with all of our heart and all of our mind and all of our soul and all of our strength. Because to love God is to obey God, right? Loving your neighbor is treating them with the love of Christ. not subjecting them to oppression. I don't care what racial group that you're a part of, not isolating a group just because of the color of their skin and pushing them into a black hole just because maybe you don't like their skin color or maybe their ancestors oppressed you, whatever the case may be, that is not demonstrating the love of Christ. And so we can't allow something like this to happen anywhere in the United States of America. This is another reason, again, why people thumb their nose at affirmative action. They thumb their nose at diversity, equity, and inclusion because we can go over the cliff with these requests for equitable access or these requests for equity in policymaking, which I don't have anything against asking for equity because it's basically looking at where somebody's at and saying, meet them where they are and recognize that some people, for example, are born with handicaps. You're not going to give them a traditional bicycle. You're going to give them a bicycle that allows them to ride it with their handicap. And so the goal is to provide an opportunity for people who don't have access historically to get access, but not to take else's access and replace it with access for someone else. And what we fail to understand is that there's enough access and there's enough opportunity for everyone. But how do we make sure that as we're articulating and advocating for things like equity, that we don't then begin to become the oppressors in the process, right? So where does this leave us? Particularly since we know that there is still heavy discrimination and bias against minority groups in America, right? And race still continues to dominate every conversation. It dominates the way the policy is written and carried out. It dominates decisions on where we decide to live, what schools we send our children to, even what churches we fellowship with on Sundays. And Sunday still continues to be one of the most segregated days of the week, right? And so, can we truly live in a post-racial society where everyone has equal opportunity? It doesn't matter your background. It doesn't matter your race. I don't know that we'll see that in my lifetime. But what we can do is we can govern ourselves according to the Spirit of truth, who will always lead us and guide us into the full understanding of truth so that our decisions reflect Jesus's words that he talks about in Matthew 22, which is to love our neighbor as we do ourselves. And so tomorrow was Good Friday, right? And we know that Good Friday represents Jesus's crucifixion, which is the biggest sacrifice anybody can make for anyone, obviously, is to lay down their life for you. And Sunday, we're celebrating Resurrection Day, which is, again, representative of the day that Jesus raised from the dead, which fundamentally gave us an opportunity to live forever in eternity with God. And so when it comes to issues like what's happening in South Africa, issues of race in America or elsewhere, I want you to ask yourself this question. What would Jesus do? Thank you for watching. Continue to keep your ears inclined to the voice of God. Keep your heart in tune with what Jesus is doing. Share this podcast with your friends. Take care and God bless.